handout that you completed last week in class about the French and Indian War. So go ahead and grab that. Press pause and then start once you have that in front of you. Now that you have your handout in front of you, I'm going to walk you quickly through the steps that we've already covered, and then the last step that I want you to know about with respect to writing an LEQ. So we said that there were 5 steps. The first step is to gather all the evidence that you can muster, so everything that you can possibly list. So that would look something like this, right? And then we said that you'll have to answer the question. So identify what your argument is going to be. If this is about a question about a turning point in American history, then you will have to say that yes, it is a turning point, or no, it isn't a turning point. Then you will create your piles of evidence and identify those piles. So what I have here is 4 piles: a political pile, an economic pile, and a social pile, and then my counterclaim. And I will have all of this evidence that I'm not going to use. I will just discard in this discard pile. Then I go ahead and write the thesis statement. So we've already talked about that. We saw that this is what's required of a thesis statement. You wrote a thesis statement. You got feedback on your thesis statement, and now it's time to go on to the last step, which is to outline and to write your body paragraphs. This is the robot, the LEQ robot, and it is a way of visualizing how you should structure your essay. You start up here with the general thesis statement, which you've already practiced, and then each of your body paragraphs, there's 3 here, there could be more, will focus on one claim or a counterclaim. This should read counterclaim down here. So let's look at what a body paragraph looks like. A body paragraph consists of a claim, which is the first sentence in your paragraph. It tells you what the paragraph is going to be about. The evidence that you will use to support that claim. The reasoning that explains why that evidence supports the claim. And then a link to your thesis that describes how your paragraph helps prove your thesis. Let's look at each of these one by one. First, your claim. Now, this is right from this handout right here, where you wrote your claims in this little general area. You should have at least 2 of those statements written, one of which might look something like this. One reason that the French and Indian War was not a turning point in relations between Britain and its colonies was that the economic ties between the two remained strong. Why don't you go ahead and try writing one of those claims right now? You can pause and then restart the video when you're done. Now that you've written a claim, the next thing is to identify at least one piece of evidence that will support that claim and describe it. I strongly suggest starting with the phrase, for example, then describing the claim, like so. For example, despite some efforts at non-importation in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, American consumption of textiles, Staffordshire pottery, and other British-made goods continued. So my evidence is that Americans were still buying a bunch of stuff, and I list some specific things that they were buying from Britain, like textiles and Staffordshire pottery. Go ahead and you try it. You can use the evidence that you included in this portion of the graphic organizer from last week. You can press pause and then continue listening once you're done. The next step is providing the reasoning, and this is where you explain how the evidence supports your claim. And since this is a turning point essay, you really need to focus on how what things were like before the turning point, the French and Indian War in this case, and after. So notice how I've underlined those 2 segments of my reasoning. And your reasoning can be more than 1 sentence long, but you have to do whatever it takes to explain how the evidence that you have provided in the sentence above supports the claim that begins your paragraph. So here's an example. Before the war, the transatlantic trade brought many British goods to the American colonies. and Americans were becoming more anglicized thanks to widespread consumption of British goods. After the war, this trend continued, supporting the claim that the economic ties between the two regions persisted. So my two reasoning sentences explain why the continued buying of consumption of British-made goods like textiles and Staffordshire pottery supports my claim that this was not a turning point, the French and Indian War, and that American colonists, both before and after the war, had high levels of consumption of British-made goods. Now you try. Take one of your pieces of evidence, the one that you wrote about, write a sentence or two that explains how it supports your claim, making sure that you include a description of how things were before and after the war. You can pause, write your sentence or sentences, and then restart. Finally, at the end of your paragraph, you will have a brief link to the thesis. This is simply where you kind of wrap up the paragraph by drawing a link back to your thesis, hence the robot arms in your robot graphic organizer. Here's an example. The persistence of these economic ties reinforces the argument that the French and Indian War was not a major turning point in Anglo-American relations. Now you try. So that's it. Once you have written your first paragraph, go ahead and write another paragraph. And this is the one I'd like you to bring into class on block day so that we can spend 5 minutes debriefing that paragraph. Thank you very much for your attention. Email me if you have any questions.